she's so fine. Hell of a ride, blows my mind. Hell of a ride, lights my...
What's good, guys? This story came out today. It's coming out of St. Louis. Trial for white cops who beat black detective like Rodney King test blue wall of silence. That's a picture of the police cruiser from St. Louis Metropolitan Police. Thanks again to Marie722 for sending me the story. Jury deliberations were scheduled to resume today in the trial of 3 white police officers charged with beating a handcuffed undercover black detective during the 2017 protests in St. Louis. All 3 have been charged with depriving Luther Hall of his civil rights under the color of law. The case is testing the so-called blue wall of silence, the unwritten rule of unwavering solidarity among law enforcement no matter the stakes, as officers have begun turning on one another. This is a picture of Detective Luther Hall. Former officers Dustin Boone and Christopher Myers and current officer Stephen Court have pleaded not guilty. Myers has an additional charge of destruction of evidence. He is alleged to have destroyed Hall's cell phone. Court has an additional charge of lying to the FBI. 2 other former officers, Randy Hayes and Bailey Coletta, previously pleaded guilty. Back in 2018, Hayes pleaded guilty to 1 count of deprivation of rights under the law. He has admitted to beating Hall with a baton and pushing him down to the ground. According to the Associated Press, Coletta pleaded guilty to making false statements to a grand jury about the assault. A federal prosecutor said text messages between officers ahead of the protest suggested an eagerness for violence against protesters. Hayes testified against his former colleague, saying Boone kept his knee on Hall's shoulder, and Court kicked Hall in the head while he was lying face down on the ground. Hayes was questioned about day after text, justifying the assault during which he claimed Hall had resisted arrest. This is a tweet from attorney Ben Crump. Luther Hall, a black undercover St. Louis PD detective, was beaten up by his white colleagues during a 2017 protest. But it should have surprised no one because those cops sent text messages beforehand saying they wanted to beat up protesters. #end qualified immunity. Let's watch this very short video that he tweeted.
3 police officers are on trial in St. Louis accused of brutally beating one of their own. In September of 2017, Detective Luther Hall was working undercover at a protest that erupted after a local police officer was found not guilty of murdering a black man that he shot after a car chase. So while at the demonstration, Hall was severely beaten by a group of police officers who say that they thought he was a protester. The trial against 3 of those officers is in its 2nd week. Following this story for us now is investigative reporter Lauren Traeger from our St. Louis affiliate. Thank you so much for joining us, Lauren. Man, this is a really, really interesting and disturbing case that I am surprised has not risen to the level of a national story. So that being said, many people may not have heard of this story, particularly because, the incident happened back in 2017. So bring us up to speed. What happened to Luther Hall back then?
Well, I think you make an excellent point. It really has not gained a lot of national attention. That's been kind of surprising to us here in the local media as well. And I think you kind of summarized it pretty well. There was some community outrage over that trial where that officer was acquitted in that murder case. So Luther Hall is a St. Louis police officer. He is African American. He was assigned that night as a detective to work undercover. So there were protests that evening. He was there not, he says, to monitor the protesters, but to gather evidence of potential crime. So if there there was property damage or people who were looking to harm others. He was there blending in with the protesters. He was in plain clothes. He did not have his duty weapon with him. And he was filming, just as many protesters do, of course. So he was blending into the crowd. And on the stand during this trial, he very emotionally described what he says happened to him, which was essentially in a very short time. He says he was rushed by a group of officers. All 5 officers who have been charged in this case are white. 3 of them still remain on trial right now. And Luther Hall says in just a matter of 15 or 20 seconds, he was taken to the ground. He was arrested and in the process pretty severely beaten and injured. He had significant injuries to his face, to his body, and he's had residual impacts from those injuries to this day. Some plates in his neck and near his shoulders. He's had pancreatitis, can still have some difficulties eating from all of this. And notably, he did have a partner that night as well, who is white and also undercover. They were not together at the time, but the partner also took the stand and testified that he too was arrested that night as a potential protester, but he was arrested by black officers and he claimed it was a completely textbook arrest. He was not injured in any single way. So some of the local community outrage here, of course, has been that Luther Hall was beaten because these officers, it's alleged, believed he was a protester and just simply a black man. And that's certainly been a lot of the testimony that's been coming out in this trial.
Yeah, so the trial, there's 3 officers on trial, but they weren't the only officers implicated in his beating. At least one other officer has he's already pleaded guilty. How did he explain himself on the stand? Because the other thing that happened too is, these officers weren't exactly upfront about what happened.
Yeah, I mean, certainly as part of the allegations from the prosecutors here is that the officers themselves had exchanged some text messages prior to the protest even starting, indicating that they wanted to beat up protesters, essentially. That's what some of the text messages, according to the prosecutors, indicate. That officer that you mentioned, he's now former officer Randy Hayes, he has since pleaded guilty. And he was questioned very significantly by the defense because initially he had said that Luther Hall was resisting or wouldn't put his hands up, wasn't complying with the arrest. And that's why they had to use some amount of force to effect the arrest. On the stand, he completely did a 180 and said, I was in the wrong. He said, upon hindsight and recollection, I was in the wrong. And Luther Hall was not resisting arrest in any way. So he did change his mind. Now, again, it's important to kind of note here that he's already pleaded guilty. He did indicate he's seeking a more lenient sentence from the federal court because he is seeing potential prison time just like these other officers are. So the defense was kind of hammering on that, saying, did you just change your mind so that you could get a better deal? But he again was saying, no, I need to come up here and tell the truth that Luther Hall was not resisting arrest when we used force on him.
So far the trial's been going on for 2 weeks. I was seeing some of the coverage from your station, and there's been suggestions that it's dragging on too long. Where does the case stand now, and how long is it expected to last?
We did get some indications yesterday that it might be starting to wrap up. The defense initially had said they were going to call up to 30 witnesses, and they have now told the judge that may not be the case. The prosecution still has the case, so they have a few more witnesses they want to call before it would go over to the defense. It's interesting here because there are 3 defendants, 3 separate officers. Each of them have their own defense attorney and are clearly taking their own defense strategies. Some of them are saying, my officer was nowhere even near the scene. Some of them are saying perhaps Luther Hall did in some ways, have some culpability in this as well. So they're each taking different strategies, which is causing the trial to go on a little bit longer. So I do think it could wrap up perhaps by the end of this week, likely into next week. But it will, of course, be up to a jury to decide whether or not these officers will be held accountable. And part of the big concern about this particular case, when this jury was picked, it is an all-white jury with only 2 black alternates. So far, it doesn't look like they're going to get to weigh in on this case. So a lot of people are sort of watching the outcome to see really where this will go. And perhaps one of the officers may be found guilty. Perhaps none of them will. It's still really up in the air at this particular time.
When I was sort of reading about this case, I thought a few things. A, how damaging this case is going to be for the relationship between the community and the police department, which, you don't need any more incidents to sort of damage that relationship. But then also I thought about the rank and file and just how they're reacting to this information. Do we know how the rank and file police officers, their take on this case?
There's an interesting kind of component to this. There are two unions that represent officers in the city of St. Louis. One represents a lot of the officers, and one represents particularly the Black officers. And they have made some remarks. That union has said they think it's sort of interesting that there is silence from a lot of the rank and file and even from the leadership, that they have not spoken out in support of Luther Hall, that there has just kind of been a lot of silence about this particular case. And I think that's part of the question for the community here is when we talk about a blue line and supporting police officers in their job, does that blue line extend to Black police officers given this particular situation? So there are certainly those folks who are saying, we really need to look at this. This is really an issue. But from the community standpoint, too, I've also seen some people who say, perhaps police need to look at their tactics. Do they need to have an undercover officer there at all? Because they feel like it was meant to monitor the protest community only. And there's some people that are maybe not in support of Luther Hall for that particular reason. So there are a lot of dynamics here at work. There has been a lot of division. And of course, there's a lot of racial division in St. Louis, as there is around the country as well. And that's why I sort of feel like this particular case is kind of a powder keg of all of it.
It's so true. I mean, what we haven't sort of touched on is in sort of the unfolding of this case, there have been allegations that the officers were particularly heavy-handed when it came to dealing with the protesters, not just Luther Hall, but other protesters, not physical, but maybe using, pepper balls or things that were really not necessary considering the way the protesters were behaving. And that's like a whole other topic of conversation. Investigative reporter Lauren Traeger with our St. Louis station KMOV, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
The article goes on to say, Hayes insisted that upon subsequent recollection, he was wrong, and Hall did not resist arrest. But defense attorneys representing the other officers seized on the inconsistencies in Hayes' previous statements and testimonies. He is awaiting sentence and faces up to 10 years. Many other current and former officers also testified during the trial. Uzoma Onwumere, an FBI agent, was a St. Louis police officer in 2017 and witnessed Hall's arrest and assault. Onwumere testified he watched Myers beat Hall despite being cuffed. Sergeant Joseph Marcantano testified he got blood on his hands when he pulled down a neck gaiter around Hall's face. When questioned by the defense, Marcantano said he never reported what he knew to the Internal Affairs Department. Hall posed as a demonstrator during protest after the not guilty verdict of former officer Jason Stockley, who was acquitted in the killing of Anthony Lamar Smith, a 24-year-old black man who died after a questionable traffic stop in 2011. Hall reportedly said he was beaten like Rodney King and sustained injuries requiring multiple surgeries. The city recently reached a settlement with Hall for $5 million. Now, this is another tweet. It's from Heather Taylor, and it says, "Wear a mask." It says, "I am reposting the ridiculous testimony of officers like Sergeant Anthony Caruso, who testified for the defense at the trial for the 3 officers federally indicted for beating Detective Luther Hall. And none of these folks have been charged for beating civilians." The tweet reads, and she's retweeting this, it says, "But Sergeant Caruso did not see what officer did this. Sergeant Caruso said he did not see anything concerning about how St. Louis City officers handled Detective Hall. Sergeant Anthony Caruso put flex cuffs on Detective Hall. Here are Detective Hall's injuries again: ruptured gallbladder, chronic pancreatitis, hole in his lip, concussion, spinal surgery, titanium discs in his neck, cadaver bone plate, and 6 screws in his neck." A charge of deprivation of civil rights under the law is a high bar to meet, with many cases ending without federal charges. As explained by the Justice Department, Section 242 of Title 18 makes it a crime for a person acting under color of any law to willfully deprive a person of a right or privilege protected by the Constitution or laws of the U.S. Under the color of law is a phrase that applies to official actors at the federal, state, and local level, including law enforcement. The Department of Justice has declined to prosecute numerous black people killed or beaten by police in recent years. In an example of that truth resonating with the people of St. Louis, the DOJ declined to bring charges against Darren Wilson, the police officer in nearby Ferguson who shot and killed the unarmed and 18-year-old Michael Brown in 2014. That trend of failing to hold police accountable for their actions has continued nearly unabated. So, that trial is going on now. They said they expected it to wrap up this week or next week, and that it has not gotten the attention that it deserves. I mean, that's the media saying that it has not gotten the attention that it deserves. I had never heard of this case until Marie722 sent me the story. So, and I'm constantly digging in cases. Please share this story. Please share it on all of your social media. Let people know that this is going on. I'm going to end the video on that note. Thanks for watching, guys.